Welcome to Sleepless Historian, where medieval life is told not through the noise of battles or kings, but through quiet stories of soil, firelight, and endurance. Tonight we return to the heart of the Middle Ages, not to castles or crusades, but to the small villages that slept under snow, where survival was an act of faith, and warmth was something earned, one breath at a time. As the last days of autumn fade, the air grows thin and sharp, and the earth begins to harden beneath the plough. The peasants move slowly across the fields, gathering the final sheaves of rye-patching roofs stacking wood. Smoke rises from chimneys in narrow trembling ribbons, the first promise of protection against the months ahead. It is a season of preparation, of whispered prayers and long silences, because in the medieval world, winter was not just cold, it was a test of what it meant to endure. Imagine it, the sun, a pale coin above a field of stubble, the wind dragging its breath through bare branches. A man walks behind his oxen, steadying the wooden plough as it cuts through the damp soil. His wife, in a shawl, patched and repatched, scatters the last handfuls of seed, trusting that the earth will remember them when spring returns. Children chase after her, laughing softly, their voices carried away by the wind. None of them know what the coming months will demand of them, only that they will face them together. In this quiet corner of medieval life, every motion has meaning. The turning of soil, the gathering of straw, the storing of onions in a clay jar. Each gesture is a small defiance of the cold. They do not fight winter. They prepare for it. They understand what the modern world often forgets, that survival is not a matter of strength, but of rhythm. You move with the season, or it moves through you. You learn to listen to the language of frost, to the creak of wood under snow, to the way silence itself seems to breathe. As daylight shortens, the village shrinks inward. Fences are mended cellars, checked tools oiled. Inside each cottage, a small fire burns, and a loaf rises slowly on the hearth. There is no electricity, no sound, but the low hum of wind against thatch, and the occasional laughter of children as they count the days until the first snow. Yet, in this simplicity, there is an intimacy. We have forgotten the closeness of family of breath, shared in the same small room of warmth, built together, hour by hour. Outside, the world prepares its own ritual, the fields quiet. The river slows beneath a skin of ice. The birds vanish toward gentler skies, leaving behind the occasional feather to mark their passing. In that silence, time itself feels slower, older. The peasants have lived with this rhythm all their lives. They know that cold will come, that hunger will whisper, that the frost will test every promise made to the earth. But they also know that life continues beneath the snow, that roots still breathe in darkness, that seeds still remember the Sunday. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them now, the shuffle of boots on frozen straw, the creak of wood as a barn door closes, the faint murmur of a prayer offered to no one in particular. These are the sounds of endurance, the heartbeat of a forgotten world. And tonight we'll follow them through their long winters and their quiet triumphs, through gardens buried under frost and fires that never quite go out. This story isn't about kings or glory. It's about the ordinary people who kept the world alive when everything around them slept. It's about patience, kindness, and the quiet strength of those who had nothing except one another, and the stubborn will to begin again when the thaw returned. In their stillness lies something deeply human, a reminder that warmth is not just a matter of fire, but of faith. So settle in. Let the world slow down for a while. Imagine the candlelight flickering against the stone walls, the faint smell of smoke, the snow falling beyond the shutter. As you listen, breathe a little deeper and let the pace of the past steady your own. If this calm journey into medieval life brings you peace tonight, don't forget to like this video, Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to Sleepless Historian. Each small gesture helps keep these quiet stories alive, stories of ordinary endurance of warmth, found in hardship, of the forgotten hands that shaped our world. Now, close your eyes to the sound of winter approaching. The first snow has begun to fall soft as breath, and somewhere in that distant medieval village, a fire is being lit. The season of frost has returned, and with it, the timeless rhythm of survival. Preparing the earth before the frost. The last days of autumn arrive with a thin metallic chill, the kind that nips at fingers and makes the breath look briefly like smoke. And on those mornings, the village turns its face toward the fields one more time, before winter closes its hand. Oxen are yoked while the light is still grey. Leather creaks, a wooden yoke knocks gently against horn, and the ploughshare dark with old soil meets the ground with a softened hiss. This is not the loud work of harvest, all bustle and shouting. It is slower, steadier, more deliberate. The earth has given what it can for the year. Now the peasants ask only for one last kindness, to let the soil sleep well. The final turning is careful and unhurried. Stubble from the harvest is folded back into the furrowed straw that escaped. The rake is gathered, and the topmost crust is broken, where it has begun to harden. The plough is an ard most days light, without a deep mould board, but in the heavier strips a heavier share is borrowed, and coaxed a little deeper, just enough to tuck the remains of the crop beneath a thin blanket of earth. A boy walks at the oxen's heads, murmuring the few syllables the beasts understand. The ploughman keeps one hand on the stilts, and the other on the line of his sight, measuring straightness by habit more than sight. The aim is not to punish the ground, but to loosen it, to let air and damp mix while there is still sun enough to dry a little before the first hard freeze. When the day lifts, carts appear with what the family has saved. For this moment, barrows of manure forked from the byre, a burlap sack of leaf mould, the sweepings from the cottage hearth. On the coast where the wind brings salt and gulls, there may be tangles of seaweed rinsed in a stream and flung in clumps that look like ropes of dark hair. Inland, there is ash from the baker's oven, crushed bone saved from the feast days, even the last green tips from the herb plot that have gone too tough to stew. Nothing is wasted if it can feed the earth. The spreading is even but modest. You can feel in the peasant's hands the arithmetic learned over years too much, and the soil turns sour too little, and spring will ask questions the winter cannot answer. As the light slips lower, ditches are cut and reopened their edges, paired so water will run rather than sit. In wet ground, the villagers have learned to throw their fields into the soft ridges and furrows that carry away the thaw. The ridges lift the roots out of the worst of the flood and give the weak sun a stronger edge. Where the wind has its own paths, low hurdles are set from woven wattle, a fence that breathes but slows the gale enough to keep the ground from being flayed. The work is plain to look at, almost unremarkable, but each small choice, the angle of a ditch, the height of a ridge, the placing of a hurdle, has been argued and taught under many winters, and each one holds a lesson paid for by hunger. At midday, they stop by the hedge and eat what is simple bread, darker than the soil's shadow, a nub of cheese, a clove of garlic that warms the mouth. Someone's hands are rubbed over the straw litter to bring back a bit of feeling. Someone else lifts the plough point and knocks off a clot of clay, so it will not harden there like a barnacle. The talk is low and practical. This strip drains toward the brook, that one toward the lane. If the brook swells, tuck the furrows a hand's width higher, and every sentence belongs to the field, not the speaker. Children chase rooks off the turned rows. then run back to their chores with cheeks flushed from cold and pride, told to gather the last fallen leaves before the frost stiffens them into uselessness. There is under the patience an edge of urgency. The sun's path is shorter by the day. Shadows arrive early and refuse to leave. In the cottages, the women have already begun to hang bundles of dried nettles and mint from the rafters, have skimmed the ash for the fine grey that sharpens soap, and in a pinch tempers soil. Near the doorway, a clay bowl waits to catch warm water from the kettle, and into that water, when tools are set down, hands will go cracked, chapped, and grateful. A seed jar is opened, not to sow, but to count and to promise. The seeds are smoothed in the palm like coin. Some will be held for the deep frost, and then the thaw, some kept back against loss, and one or two slipped to a neighbour whose own jar looks too light. Sometimes there is a gesture that borders prayer. A pinch of salt crosses a furrow. A line is traced on the plough, with a finger blackened by ash. A few quiet words are given to the air, without asking for much, only that the ground will not heave and tear the roots, that the thaw will be kind, that the oxen will not founder in the mire when the rains return. No one expects miracles. They have learned the cost of asking too much, but they also know the comfort of speaking to something larger than their own body's warmth, the season itself perhaps, or the habit of patience that has seen so many winters through. As the afternoon dims, the work turns from earth to edges the places where weather first makes its claim. Gaps in hedges are bound with brash. Loose thatch around the byre is pushed back into place and pinned with a willow rod. Tight bundles of straw are laid at the foot of the garden's low wall where the wind sneaks in. The little kitchen plot, the place where herbs and tender leaves have given so many small meals, is tucked under a layer of straw and leaf, and the path between the beds is swept clean, so no one will lose their footing when the first sheet. Ice makes the ground a sly partner. The tools are wiped and set under a lean-to handles up iron points, oiled with whatever was handy, a smear of grease, a rub of tallow. Before leaving the field entirely, the ploughman looks back and measures the day's line with his eyes. It will never be perfectly straight. No furrow truly is in ground that lives, but the eye knows what the hand has done well. He squints at the ditch, and the way the water already glints in it checks the small spillway cut toward the lane, and feels with the side of his boot where the ridge wears thin, then pushes a little more soil up with the toe. It is not neat work, but it is honest, and it is done in time. In the east, a hush falls across the stubble. In the west, the cloud edge takes the colour of cooled iron. Even the animals understand the season. The oxen step heavier as they turn home steam, lifting from their flanks and hanging like a veil. The hens gather near the door earlier, their bodies a soft, shifting pile of feathered patience. A dog waits where the light from the cottage window spills thinly onto the yard, its tail moving slow, as if to mark the seconds between one day and the next. Inside a fire is coaxed a little brighter. The floor by the hearth is swept. A pot is hung. The talk resumes quiet, turning over the work done and the work yet to do, but always with the sense that the larger part is now in the ground's hands. By full dark, the village is smaller, enclosed by its own breathing. The field rests under its new seams, the ditches cut their first narrow channels, and the straw laid over tender places whispers whenever the wind stirs. Somewhere water moves faint as a thought. Somewhere else a barn door thumps twice, and then is still. Preparation is not a victory to be cheered. It is the opposite of a boast. It is the right shape of care, performed in the only time left to perform it. The peasants know that nothing they have done will stop winter. They also know that winter will be different because they did it. At the threshold, the last warning glances up. Stars thin and cold have come early. Breath lifts and unravels. In the morning, if the frost takes, the topsoil will sparkle as if scattered with ground glass, and the ridges will show their small, steady courage. For now the door is pulled, to the latch dropped, and the house gathers its heat. Outside the earth holds what has been given to it. Straw ash leaves the memory of the share's passage and begins its long, necessary silence. Inside hands remember the feel of handles and furrows, even as they warm around a cup. The day has taught its last lesson. To prepare the earth before the frost is to choose patience over panic, to trust the slow arithmetic of small acts, and to leave the night with something honest working quietly beneath it. Seeds of survival. When the earth has finally been turned and the tools laid to rest, attention shifts inward to the smallest, lightest things that decide who will eat and who will wait the seeds. In a medieval cottage, they are not kept in sacks or jars by chance. They are measured, counted, guarded, like a memory. A year's labour can fit inside a wooden box, no wider than a man's chest, wrapped in bits of linen, tucked on a shelf above the smoke line where mice hesitate to climb. On cold evenings, the family gathers around that box, not to admire it, but to take stock of what life has left them for the coming year. Each seed is a question asked to the future. Will you grow again for me? The selection begins with experience more than science. Peasants knew which grains survived, frost which roots would rot if planted too early, which herbs refused to wake before the light returned. Their choices were shaped by centuries of watching what lived through the storms. In the north, it was rye, the dark, stubborn grain that laughed at snow. In the Midlands, barley and oats carried the villages through. In the south, where winters were gentler, wheat might still be dared, though never trusted. Cabbage, turnip, leek and onion, these were not luxuries, but the bones of survival. They could freeze and thaw and still forgive you for it. Rye was a friend that asked little. It could be sown late buried shallow, and yet rise again when the snow melted. Its stalks stood thin but proud, and when ground, the flour came out darker than bread should ever be, but it filled the stomach and gave strength enough to swing the plough. There was a saying in those days that rye feeds the humble and humbles the proud, for even the wealthiest, when hunger pressed hard, found themselves grateful for its rough sweetness. To bake with rye was to accept the earth's realism. Barley and oats had their own temperaments. Oats were forgiving, they tolerated cold rain and thin soil, but they asked to be eaten quickly or turned sour. Barley was steadier, a grain of monks and alewives hearty enough for bread, but happiest in beer. In monasteries, where calendars were kept with care, the monks would mark on waxed tablets the day barley should go into the ground after frost adjusting by the moon's temper. Peasants nearby simply watched the colour of the hedges. When the willow buds showed white, it was time. The ritual of dividing seed from grain for food was never easy. Hunger and foresight wrestled across the same table. You might have a bowl of grain that could feed your children tonight, or feed the village months from now, if spared. Many families compromised grinding what was cracked or shriveled, saving only the firmest kernels for the field. It was a discipline taught by scarcity and repeated every year like confession. Inside the cottage, the sorting had its rhythm. The mother or eldest daughter spread a cloth across the table and poured out the saved grain. Fingers worked quickly, testing weight, picking out husks, whispering the names of crops, as though speaking to old friends. The father might weigh the small bags by hand, feeling the heft of a season's promise. Children learned by imitation by the way their parents' faces changed when a kernel split wrong between their nails. They were learning the language of survival long before they could read. Seeds for gardens, the cabbages, the leeks, the herbs were even more personal. These did not come from markets or lords' granaries, but from one's own small patch of earth. Women especially knew which plants had been kindest that year, which heads had formed tight and sweet, even under frost. The outer leaves were stripped, the cores dried, and saved. Each family had its own way of marking them, a twist of string, a smear of coloured wax, a dried blossom tied to the stem. These were heirlooms of endurance, passed quietly from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour. To lose them was to lose a part of the household's memory. Beyond the walls of the village markets, sometimes offered new varieties brought by traders, Italian beans, Flemish brassicas, or hardy pulses from the east. But peasants were cautious with strangers, even those that came in the form of seeds. One year's experiment could mean next winter's hunger. Most chose the safety of the known, for the known had already been tested by the frost. When the seed box is finally closed, the family turns again to the land. They study which plots have rested long enough, which need breaking again in spring. The three-field system, where one field lies fallow each year, is not an invention of clever scholars. It is a conversation between soil and stomach. By letting one strip rest, they give the earth time to breathe, and in return it gives them one more season of bread. The logic is ancient and patient. What you spare today feeds you tomorrow. Outside, the wind begins to turn from east to north. In the dim light, the bare branches move like slow handwriting against the sky. Men walk the boundary ditches, carrying small sacks of grain in their arms, testing the ground with their boots. It is too early to sow, but they think ahead to the moment when the frost breaks its hold and the soil softens. They imagine where the furrows will run. How many rows can be spared for beans or peas? How many must belong to rye? In their minds they already see the green haze of spring rising from the earth, like a promise fulfilled. At home by the hearth, the smallest seeds are stored in pouches tied close to the heat. These are the fragile ones, herbs and pulses, the delicate reminders of summer. Beside them hang onions, braided in ropes, garlic clusters, turning slowly to gold in the smoke. The air smells of earth, ash, and patience. A cat sleeps on the warm stone's tail curled around a jar of lentils, as if guarding the future. There is beauty in this economy of trust. Every act of saving seed is an act of faith that the world will continue, that soil and sun will keep their word. The peasants could not write that faith down, so they lived it instead. A handful of grain held against the heart on a freezing morning was more than food. It was proof that life had endured through another cycle. Sometimes, before the longest night of the year, the village priest would bless the seed stores. He would walk from house to house, carrying a sprig of evergreen touching door frames, muttering prayers in Latin, half understood, but fully believed. The people bowed not to him, but to the idea that words might protect what hands could not. When he was gone, they would seal the storage jars with clay and tuck straw round them to keep the frost from biting through. The seeds slept then, as the land would soon sleep, both waiting for the same signal of warmth. By the time the snow falls heavy, the fields are white and still. Beneath that quiet surface lie all the tiny chances of survival, each kernel, each root fragment, each bulb hidden under straw. The peasants rest, or try to. They mend tools, patch clothes, tell stories, but their thoughts circle always back to those buried hopes, those sleeping grains. They imagine the thaw, the first drip of water from the eaves, the day when they will open the box again and step into the furrows with their palms full of life. In this way, the medieval year folds upon itself. Winter is not only an ending, but a pause between breaths and the seed, like the heart beats quietly in the dark, waiting for the Sunday. To hold a seed in one's hand is to hold time itself a fragment of last year's harvest, a promise of the next, and the memory of every winter survived before. And so as snow gathers on the thatch, and the wind hums softly through the cracks, the peasants sleep with the certainty that somewhere in the quiet earth life is already preparing to return. The art of keeping warm. When winter finally begins to show its teeth, the peasants turn their minds not to comfort, but to protection. Warmth is not something they chase. It is something they defend carefully, deliberately, like a candle flame shielded from the wind. The air has grown sharper now. Water in the pails wears a thin glass lid by dawn, and the morning breath of oxen rises like pale ghosts above the byre. The fields no longer hum with work, yet life continues, in smaller, quieter gestures, smoke from chimneys, the shuffle of straw carried from barns, the faint crack of ice breaking in a trough. In the world of the medieval peasant, warmth begins with what is closest to the earth. The gardens, those modest rectangles of survival that cling to the sides of cottages, are the first to feel the season's cruelty. By now, most of their beds have been cleared of harvest, but the hardiest vegetables still stand: cabbage, leek, parsnip, a few stubborn turnips, pushing their crowns above the soil. They are the winter's colour, dull green and grey, holding fast against the cold. To protect them, the peasants work as though tucking a child to sleep. They pile straw around the stalks, lay mats of bracken over the ground, and spread thin branches to keep the covering from blowing away. When the frost stiffens the air, these small defences make the difference between a meal and an empty bowl. Closer to the cottage walls, small frames of woven sticks called wattles stand like sentinels. They are simple things, thin willow branches bent and threaded together, set upright to catch the wind. Yet they turn a biting gust into a whisper. Behind them, air lingers just warm enough for life to hesitate before surrendering. Every yard of fencing, every bit of brush laid at the garden's edge, changes the way the wind moves through the world. It is a lesson learned not from books, but from generations watching how frost creeps and how it can be slowed. In the richer villages or near monastic gardens, there is another trick: the hotbed. It is an art borrowed from observation of decay itself. Peasants gather heaps of manure, straw, and leaves and let them ferment beneath a shallow layer of soil. The slow, invisible fire of decomposition warms the bed from below, enough to coax herbs and early greens to live a little longer. The warmth rises like a secret breath through the soil, invisible but steady. Above it, simple lids of wood and oiled cloth, or even discarded panes from a broken monastery window, trap what little heat the day can offer. To stand over such a bed on a morning of frost and feel a ghost of warmth through one's boots is to believe for a moment that even the coldest world holds mercy. Inside the cottages, warmth is a more personal craft. The hearth is the centre of everything, the heart of the home, the keeper of time. It must never die completely. A handful of embers is always left beneath the ash before sleep, and in the grey hour before dawn, someone rises to feed them. The firewood has been chosen with care months earlier: oak and beech for slow-lasting heat, birch for quick flame to catch the morning light. Peat dug from the bog and dried in the sun burns with a dull red glow and a smell that clings to every thread of clothing. Sometimes, when the woodpile shrinks, too fast dried dung or straw briquettes fill the gaps, and the smoke turns thick and sweet. Warmth has many shapes, and none are wasted. The peasants have a kind of quiet genius for keeping heat where it belongs. Windows, if they can be called, that are small, covered in greased parchment instead of glass. It lets in a blur of light, but keeps the wind at bay. The doors are thick, hung low, so that even a short person must stoop to enter, letting less of the day's precious warmth escape. At night, families gather close sleeping on benches near the hearth or on straw pallets layered with old sacks and wool. They use their own breath, their own bodies, as the final wall against the cold. A family's warmth is a communal work. The heat of animals below the loft, the low fire, the press of sleeping forms, all combine to hold back the winter's reach. Above the living space, the loft or garret serves as both store and refuge. There dried herbs hang from rafters, sage, mint, thyme, and the scent mixes with the faint warmth rising from the fire below. It is not comfort in the modern sense. It is a modest reprieve, a space where one can feel that survival is still possible. Even the animals are part of this design. The cow buyer shares a wall with the cottage, its beasts radiating a slow living heat through the stones. Chickens huddle in corners, their feathers trembling softly. The sound of breathing human and animal creates a rhythm that fills the silence left by the vanished insects and birds of summer. Sometimes, in the depth of cold, a thin hoarfrost forms even inside the window frame. Children wake to find white feathers of ice traced on the walls, beautiful in their cruelty. A mother might draw her finger through them and whisper half to herself, "The world is still alive, it only sleeps." These small phrases repeated over centuries are how people made peace with what they could not change. The winter was never kind, but it could be endured if it was understood. The warmth of the body itself becomes a tool. Peasants know how to move without wasting breath, how to work just enough to keep blood alive, how to rest before the sweat cools and turns to chill. Clothing is layered with a careful logic linen nearest the skin to draw away damp wool above it, to trap the air leather on the outside to block the wind. Each thread holds history. Garments are patched so often they become palimpsests of the winters that came before. A cloak might outlive 2 generations, growing heavier and softer smelling of smoke and earth and survival. The community too becomes part of this warmth. Neighbours share embers when one hearth goes cold. They gather in the long evenings to mend tools, twist rope, or simply sit close enough for their shoulders to touch. In that nearness, stories are told, the old ones about saints who crossed frozen rivers barefoot, or spirits that haunt the moors, or miracles of springs that never freeze. Each tale burns a little like fire, giving heat to the hours until the logs turn to ash. It is an unwritten rule, no one lets another freeze alone. Beyond the human walls, the land itself begins to adapt. Snowdrifts gather along hedges and fences, forming natural shelters where rabbits and pheasants hide. Beneath that pale roof, the temperature stays gentler, the same way it does under straw or thatch. The peasants watching this take it as another lesson. The snow is not an enemy, it is a blanket laid by nature's hand. It hides the fields, yes, but it also protects them. Beneath it, seeds and roots breathe more easily, guarded from the bite of wind. Each evening as darkness swallows the last outline of the world, the village glows from within. Thin threads of light leak from every doorway, weaving together across the night like the veins of a living body. A passerby could imagine that the entire village breathes in unison, drawing in the cold exhaling warmth, and, in a sense, it does. Every fire, every body, every animal adds to a shared heartbeat that keeps the community alive. By midwinter, the peasants know that true warmth is not measured in degrees, but in endurance. It is not about being comfortable, it is about being steadfast. Their craft of keeping warm is less a battle and more a conversation with the season, a constant exchange of energy and faith. They have learned to borrow heat from decay, from beasts, from one another, from the patience of stone. They know that cold does not only take, it also teaches. It sharpens the will, pares away excess, reveals what truly matters. And so while the wind wails across the hills and the stars seem carved from ice, a small flame flickers behind every shuttered window, stubborn and steady. The peasants sleep near it, wrapped in wool and in one another's breath, trusting that this narrow circle of warmth will hold until the sun returns. In the silence between their heartbeats, the world waits with them, frozen, faithful and alive. The hidden heat. Winter is not only cold, it is full of small, patient warmths that hide in plain sight. The peasants learn them the way a child learns a mother's footsteps, by listening without looking. Heat is not just inside the hearth. It lingers in stone, waits on the south face of a wall, gathers where the wind forgets to pass, and sleeps in living things that share their breath with the air. To live through the long months is to notice every place where the world is a little kinder, and to build life around those mercies. Begin with stone. Nothing in the village remembers sunlight as faithfully as stone. The south wall of a cottage, rough with lichens and old mortar, stands like a quiet battery of the Sunday. Even on short days, light leans there longest, and the wall drinks what it can. After dusk, when frost creeps out from hedges, your palm pressed against that stone will still find a whisper of the afternoon. It is not heat as a fire would give, but it is temperance enough to keep a cabbage from biting enough to convince a sprig of thyme to keep its scent. So the peasants set their herb benches under that wall. A few bee-skeps crouch there too, wooden bellies warming more gently than they would in open field. The wall does not boast. It holds a memory and gives it back in careful increments. Beyond walls, the land itself arranges warmth like a quiet math. Cold air is heavy. It slides at night into hollows and sleeps there. Frogs and peasants both understand the law: what lies lowest freezes first. So tender things are planted on the shoulder of a slope, never at the foot. A south-facing bank, even one the height of a man, turns winter into something negotiable. Snow thins there, light arrives a little earlier, and wind, baffled by the rise, passes over, as if forgetting a name. On such a bank you might see the year's first green, a shy line of sorrel, or the narrow blades of chives turning toward February. The peasants will smile, without showing teeth. The land has kept its quiet promise. Hedges, too, are more than boundaries. Hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, woven and laid, until each branch becomes a link in a living fence. The hedge is a keeper of birds and a mender of wind. In its lee, the air slows and eddies, trading cruelty for rest. Snow drifts there, forming a low white wall that shelters the furrow immediately below. Beneath that curved roof, the ground stays a few heartbeats, warmer the difference between ice and sleep. The peasants read the hedge like a line of scripture, where it thickens plant leaks, where it thins keep only things that forgive the cold. In time, the hedge learns the village, and the village learns the hedge, each reshaping the other. Even the ways houses stand together are a kind of weathercraft. Cottages bend their shoulders toward one another. Roofs pitch to shed the north wind down the lane rather than across the yards. A bakehouse placed at the lane's end becomes a windbreak during storms, and on baking days its brick belly radiates a soft, generous heat into the space around it. Those mornings are a small festival in winter loaves, proofing on boards children, holding out numb fingers to the oven's sigh shirts, pegged on a line nearby to steal a little warmth and dry while bread rises. Work is arranged to borrow heat from other work. Bread day becomes wash day, not by doctrine but by common sense. Within the monastery walls, the geometry of warmth is almost a theology. Cloisters form sun traps, a square of grass framed by vaulted walks where wind cannot hurry. At midday, light spreads along the stone like honey. Brothers carry trays of seedlings to the south walk. Sisters set jars there to catch what the day will give. Everything about the cloister plans for gentleness, fountains, mute the mind's clamour. But in winter, their basins are covered to keep ice from prying at the stone. If a window breaks, the lead light is mended quickly, not only to save parchment from damp, but to keep the scriptorium's temperature from sliding into bitterness, where fingers cannot hold pens without pain. Warmth is discipline, a promise the house keeps to its labour. There are smaller tricks everywhere. Dark surfaces drink light, pale ones refuse it. A sheet of soot-darkened slate set behind a bench, leached of sun, keeps a pot of rosemary alive 3 weeks longer than the same pot left against the ash-grey wall. Barrels of water by the cottage door, warmed slightly by the day, give back their hoarded softness at night, so the air nearby hardly ever bites as hard. A smooth river-stone, kept by the hearth, and wrapped in a scrap of wool, travels to the bed-feet on nights when the north wind remembers everyone's name. None of these are inventions. They are recognitions, the way a hand tends to move toward a remembered shape in the dark. Warmth can be borrowed from life as well. The buyer shares its back with the cottage, not only to shorten the farmer's steps, but to let the cattle's slow heat seep through the stones. You can feel it if you stand in the corner where the plaster is cracked a breath from the next room, animal and honest. Above in the loft hay keeps the roof's underskin thick, and between thatch and beam there is a country of mice and beetles and the small rustling citizens of winter. Their bodies are hearths, the size of thimbles, but 1,000 thimbles of heat are not nothing. The peasants do not welcome the mice in the flour bin, yet they do not worship a sterile cold. Life warms life, and the line between nuisance and neighbour is managed, not obliterated. Compost heaps are furnaces of another kind. Set where a fence bends, they shoulder the wind, and by their low, constant fever defend the yard from knife-cold gusts. In the heart of the heap, even on a January noon that never turns to day, steam unfurls if you turn it with a fork. Children love this proof that winter is not a single story. They stand on old planks sunk into the heap and watch their bootprints breathe. Later, that same compost will feed the spring beds, for now it is a small sun domestic and brown, working in secret. Not all warmth is for the skin. Some warmth lives in air the wind cannot find. A hollow in the woods, where firs crowd close, will be 5 degrees, kinder on nights when the village lanes wear rime like salt. There the air is a slow tide, thick with the resin of green wood and the mild breath of earth under needles. Hunters find it by habit, as do women looking for a place where water can be drawn without the bucket film freezing while they walk. The forest's edge, especially where it meets south-facing stone, becomes a chapel of reprieve. Birds gather there, and so do people when their bodies demand an answer softer than the skies. All these temperings of cold form a map that only the living keep. It passes from eye to eye, knee to knee, through the way a mother points with her chin rather than her hand, through the way a grandfather walks an extra yard to tie the gate where a draught sneaks in. The knowledge is not stored in a book because it is stored everywhere else in walls and hedges, in the angle of a path in which window is shuttered first and which last. It is not secret yet. It is easy to miss if you live too quickly. The peasants do not live quickly. By late winter, when the cold has learned every door's habit and the sun stands longer but not yet strong, the village's hidden heats knit together into a survivable day. A woman rinses linen at noon and hangs it by the bakehouse. A boy brings jars to the cloister walk's southern bench. A man spreads new wattles along a gap in the hedge where the wind has begun to speak too loudly. An old monk turns the compost with a fork and watches steam spell out his breath. No one claims invention. Everyone keeps a vow to notice warmth wherever it lives and to move their lives an inch closer to it. And when evening comes, as it always does, the south wall of the cottage holds its little afterglow. The byre breathes through stones, the hedge cups a drift of snow like a hand protecting a flame, and the slope above the brook shows under the plest moon a pale film where frost has not dared to take hold. Inside, a stone wrapped in wool is passed from elder to child, and a smile trades across the room without a word. Hidden heat like hope rarely announces itself. It only keeps working quietly until the season that needed it loosens its grip. Beneath the ground. When the first deep frost settles and the fields turn to iron, the peasants look downward, not to what is frozen, but to what must be hidden. Winter in the medieval world is not simply endured on the surface, it is survived beneath it. The earth, once the place of labour and toil, becomes a quiet vault, a keeper of food and memory. What cannot live in the open must sleep below, guarded by straw sand and faith. Beneath the ground, warmth still lingers faint as breath under a blanket. The season of storage begins long before the snow. In the last weeks of autumn, when the air still smells faintly of wet soil and smoke, families turn their attention to their underground world, the pits, the cellars, the small earthen hollows that will cradle what remains of the harvest. For the medieval peasant preservation is not science, it is an art of trust. Everything saved is a promise whispered to the months ahead. Stay with us a little longer. The root cellar, simple, dark and cool, is the heart of that promise. Often dug into the side of a hill or beneath the cottage floor, it is built not with beauty in mind, but with precision. The walls are made of stone or packed clay. The ceiling is low to keep the air heavy and still. Straw lines the floor to absorb damp. A single vent no wider than a wrist allows the faintest draught to move through, preventing rot, but never letting the cold bite too deep. The peasants understand the balance instinctively. Air must breathe, but not too much. Moisture must stay, but not drown. Inside the air is different, cool, earthy, thick, with the scent of last year's soil. Here rest the roots that fed the summer carrots and turnips, beets and onions, stacked in layers like notes in a long song. Each layer is divided by straw or sand, sometimes both, so they do not touch and wound each other. The sand, fine and dry, holds them steady, keeping their skins from shrivelling, their hearts from rotting. The sound of the sand poured from a bucket is like rain reversed, a soft, patient rhythm that belongs only to this season. Not all food is stored the same way. Some families, when they have little stone to build with dig storage pits, narrow shafts cut into frozen ground, lined with bark and sealed with planks and earth. Inside, wrapped in dry leaves or burlap the roots, lie together in silence. Snow will fall, the ground will close over them, and for months no one will see their faces. Yet in spring, when the pit is opened there, they will be pale, wrinkled, but alive, carrying the taste of earth as if no time had passed. The cellar also keeps seeds, small paper ghosts of the summer gone. They are stored high near the rafters, where the air is drier, safe from damp and mice. Each small pouch or jar bears its own story barley, saved from the best sheaf cabbage seeds, from the head that stood longest in frost beans, taken from the pod that hung against the Sunday. To the peasants, these are not possessions. They are lives waiting to wake. The cellar, in its quiet way, is both tomb and nursery. Somewhere near the back, in the coldest corner, hang ropes of garlic and onions. They twist slowly in the draught, like pendulums, marking time in scent instead of sound. Above them, strips of dried meat precious, salted with care, hang from beams. These are luxuries reserved for illness or feast. Most days the family will eat bread roots and broth, but to know that such food waits below the floorboards gives courage. Even hunger can be softened by the idea of enough. When snow covers the village, the cellar becomes a living thing. Each trip down the narrow ladder or uneven steps feels like descending into the body of the earth. The air tightens, breath becomes visible. A candle is carried carefully cupped against draughts. Its light reveals the slow work of time straw pressed flat frost gathering on stone, a small mouse hole patched with clay. Down here, silence has texture. You can hear your own heart steady as the soil's pulse. It is not unusual for a peasant to speak to the cellar as one would to an old friend. A murmur of thanks when a basket of roots is lifted, a soft sigh when the shelves look thin. The words are not superstition so much as acknowledgement the earth has given what it could. There are no saints in these walls, only the memory of labour of hands, planting, pulling, washing, storing. When food runs low, they do not curse the ground. They simply tighten the belt and wait for light to lengthen again. There are small rituals of care. Each month, when weather allows, the head of the family will check the cellar. He turns the roots, gently removes. What has begun to spoil brushes away mould with a rag dipped in vinegar. He replaces the straw where it has flattened and opens the vent to let the air refresh. This is quiet work, done mostly in half-darkness. The cellar does not reward haste, it rewards constancy. Children sometimes follow, curious about this underworld. They ask if the vegetables can hear the snow falling above. The parents smile but do not answer. Maybe they can. In the stillness of deep winter, when every sound seems magnified, it is easy to believe that the earth listens to footsteps, to shovels, to songs, hummed softly as people work. Even the rats seem to move with reverence here, as if they too know this place is sacred to survival. Beyond the cottage, the same wisdom shapes larger storage granaries for the Lord communal pits for villages too poor to build cellars. These places are guarded carefully. The grain is measured, sealed, blessed, and watched. To lose it is to lose not just food, but the thread of the year itself. In famine years, the opening of the communal pit is an event of sorrow and gratitude. Mingled villagers kneel, scoop, and weigh with trembling fingers, knowing the measure between enough and despair could be a handful of rye. Still beneath the fear, there is a strange comfort. The peasants understand that the ground remembers warmth, even when the air forgets. If you dig deep enough, the frost never reaches. The soil, slow and faithful, keeps its own temperature, its own promise. When a man buries his food in it, he buries a little of his hope too, and somehow, in spring, both come back to him. Sometimes at night, when the wind moans through the chimney and snow taps at the shutter, someone will mention the cellar not to boast, but to reassure. The carrots will keep, the beets will last. The turnips are sleeping soundly. Such words carry warmth that no fire could give. It is the comfort of knowing that beneath the frozen ground life continues unseen. The peasants do not have words like ecosystem or temperature control. They have only their senses. The smell of earth, the feel of air against skin, the way the candle flame bends when the vent is open. Yet their understanding is precise, born of repetition and humility. They do not fight the cold, they bargain with it, finding shelter in its shadow. And so the months pass. Above ground frost bites, wood and stone. Below the cellar breathe slow and even. The roots soften but do not spoil. The seeds sleep, the sand stays cool. When at last the thaw comes, and the first trickles of meltwater run down the hill, the peasants open their cellars and find that the world has kept its word. The air that rises smells of damp straw and distant sunlight. In that scent, they feel the quiet triumph of those who trusted the earth to remember them. Beneath the ground, life has been waiting all along, patient, persistent, and faithful. It is not a miracle. It is the ordinary genius of survival. The peasants know this and bow their heads not in worship, but in respect. For every root that endures the dark is a testament to the same truth that keeps them alive. Even in silence, even in cold, the earth never truly sleeps. When snow becomes a blanket, the first honest snow arrives without drama, as if the sky simply decided to rest on the earth for a while. It begins with a hush that even children understand, a softening of edges, a slowing of breath. Flakes drift past the cottage window like small decisions unhurried certain. By dawn, the lanes are erased, hedges shouldered into round white shapes, and the thatch wears a clean cap that narrows the world to what is near. Sound changes too. The hammer from the smithy no longer carries. The bell in the church tower rings into wool and comes back gentled. Snow does not only cover things, it quiets them, and in that quiet the peasants listen to what winter is really saying. For them, snow is not merely cold. It is a shelter if one knows how to live inside it. The ground that would crack under hard frost lies mild beneath the drift. Roots sleep better there, the way a child sleeps better under a blanket than on a bare bed. Winter, wheat, and rye stitched into the fields before the freeze settle under their new quilt and hold their breath. Without snow, the soil would heave freezing, swelling, loosening the plants until they break their own hold. With snow, the temperature moves more slowly, like a careful hand turning a page. Nothing panics. In the garden, straw laid over leeks and cabbages now takes the snow as a second layer, straw for breath, snow for steadiness. The peasants pass by these mounds with a satisfaction that shows only in their shoulders. The worst edge has been softened. There are perils, and they are known. A hard crust after sleet can lock air away from the shoots. A thaw that runs too quickly off frozen ground can drown the lowest furrows before the ditches wake. But the villagers read the snow the way they read the sky. They kick a drift to learn its grain. They slice a spade, edge into a crust to break a seal near the cabbages. They tamp path, snow firm so it will melt slow and send water where the land can bear it. Even chores adjust to the new grammar. Sledges replace carts. Water is brought in blocks when the well mouth films over. Those blocks are lifted to a barrel by the hearth to become a day's worth of softness. On the roof, a broom knocks at the eaves to keep icicles from tugging the thatch loose. None of this is dramatic. It is the ordinary liturgy of snow days, small acts repeated until they become wisdom. In the lanes, the world writes its record plainly. Hairprints stitch between the hedges. Foxprints write the answer. Birds draw their brief music in the powder wings, leaving a parted comma where they lifted feet, fretting where they found a seed. Children learn to read this script before they read any other, calling out softly when they find a story that ends or begins behind a woodpile. They are sent to scatter a handful of chaff at the hedge's lee, not because birds are pets, but because hunger taught the village long ago that mercy given returns somehow often in ways one cannot measure. And in any case, a hedge alive with small hearts beats a little warmth into the day. At night, the snow turns light into a quiet companion. Moon and drift speak across the fields without a word. The cottage windows shine further than they did in autumn, their squares of gold thrown back by white ground like answers. Men step out to the byre and see their breath in the same silver as the skies. For a moment, it is easy to believe that the whole village is a lantern whose wick will not go out. Many times, this is what steadies them, not the fire at their own hearth, but the thought of all fires together, holding the dark in place. Inside snow rearranges hours. Work that belonged to the fields now yields to the work of hands, mending harness, whittling pegs, turning a broken rake tooth until it fits again. The rhythm is close and human. Cloth is thawed by the fire before it is stitched, sinew warmed and flexed before it is pulled taut. The pot that simmers on the bar nestles against a wedge of ice laid in a bucket, so tomorrow will not begin with a hammer at the well. Talk is small and kind. Stories are told in pieces, the way a loaf is cut and shared. The oldest will sometimes speak of winters when drift swallowed fences and the lanes ran like rivers when the thaw came. From the youngest, listen, with polite disbelief, and tuck the image away, the way people always tuck away what they think they will never need. Snow also redraws the land, so that the peasants may see it anew. Places where wind leaps show as scoured low ribs of field bone shining through. Places where wind rests pile high, making sudden hills that turn a short walk into a small expedition. Those mounds are not random. They teach where a new wattle ought to stand, come spring where a hedge must thicken, where a path would be kinder if it veered a hand's breadth to the left. In this way, snow is a surveyor. It shows the village its own shape by exaggerating its habits. The peasants take note without paper. Next year's fence will drift less. Next year's cabbages will sit where the wind neglects them. Sometimes when the day is windless, and the sky the colour of pewter, the village falls into a silence so complete that a distant magpie sounds like a bell. In that stillness, the peasants feel two truths at once: how small they are and how held. Snow presses the noise out of the air until only essentials remain: the creak of leather, the rattle of a latch, the crackle of a log. There is holiness in that poverty of sound. Work grows careful within it. Hands move slower, eyes linger longer on each task. A spoon is smoothed until it fits its owner's palm as a river stone fits a pocket. A bundle of twigs is tied with an economy of string that would make a sailor proud. Time belongs not to the clock. There is none but to the way the day lightens and then leaves. When thaw comes, it comes politely at first. The eaves begin to talk. Icicles slim drop by drop. A hen scratches at the yard and finds the ground pliant under a mere finger's depth. Then the village leans forward. Ditches must be cleared of the first eager water. The tamped paths give up their hoard one measured cup at a time. The hedge drifts collapse and slide inward, feeding the soil right where roots wait. Snow does not simply vanish, it returns what it borrowed. The peasant's guide that return with a broom, a spade, a boot heel, making sure the low strips drink before the high ones glut, making sure the barn's threshold stays dry enough to keep hooves sure. There is a day each year no one can name it until it has passed, when the snow still lies in shadows. But the air above it has forgotten to be hard. On that day, steam lifts from compost like a blessing, and a child's cheeks burn pink, not from cold, but from running. The smell changes almost invisibly at first. Under the smoke and wool there is a thread of wet earth far away and near at once. The peasants do not rush. They continue to walk the lanes with the old winter patience, because the sky can still change its mind. But their eyes begin to search the south banks for a blade of something green, and the hand that empties the last bucket into the barrel before bed lingers a moment in the water, as if asking a question. If snow is a blanket, it is one the village lays together with the sky. It is a pact between cold and life, a way of saying that rest is not surrender, but preparation. The peasants keep that pact with their small skills, breaking a crust to give breath, setting a sled run so a back will not break, sweeping a roof so the thatch will see spring. Snow thanks them by keeping what they love, undamaged soil seed stone, and by making the world beautiful in a way that feels sturdy rather than delicate. And when it leaves, it does not leave empty-handed. It goes into the ground and becomes grass and leaf, and the cool in a clay cup lifted in July. So they do not resent the white months, not truly. They accept them as they accept the night necessary, clarifying, full of a silence that teaches. And the lesson learned every year and never exhausted is simple enough to carry without words under a good blanket life, remembers how to breathe. The winter table. When the nights grow longest and the air turns sharp enough to sting the lungs life inside the medieval cottage, gathers around a single centre the table. It is not grand, only a board of oak or pine, scarred by years of knives, bowls and elbows. But in winter, it becomes the hearth's companion, the altar of daily endurance. The table is where hunger meets memory, where every crumb carries the story of what was saved and what was lost. Food in winter is less about appetite and more about discipline. The larders have been tallied, the cellar measured like a book of hours. Each day takes a small line from its pages, and the family must read carefully so that the last line lasts until the thaw. There are no banquets now, only patterns of modest repetition, bread broth, root silence. Yet there is comfort in that rhythm, for it reminds them that they have prepared well, that the labour of autumn was not in vain. The bread, dark as bark, lies at the heart of the meal. It is coarse rye, sometimes mixed with barley or peas, heavy enough to sit in the stomach like a stone, and strong enough to carry through a morning's work. The crust cracks beneath a knife, and the scent sour and warm fills the room with a memory of ovens and summer air. Children are given the ends, the heels believed to protect them from hunger's spirit. The adults cut thin slices and lay them carefully as if dividing a day's light. When the bread hardens, it is soaked in broth or ale. Nothing is wasted, not even the crumbs that cling to a sleeve. The broth itself is a slow, smoky companion. In most homes, it never truly leaves the fire. The cauldron hangs by an iron hook and changes flavour. As days pass, a bone added a handful of dried peas, a wedge of turnip, a sprig of thyme, if one remembers to fetch it from the window ledge. What simmers today is not the same as what will simmer tomorrow. The peasants call it perpetual stew, though they rarely name it at all. It is simply the pot. It welcomes whatever the day can spare, swallowing everything into a thick, forgiving comfort. Even the poorest can keep such a pot alive, and it is said that when you stir it, you are stirring the house's fortune. There are roots, of course, always roots. Turnips, carrots, beets, onions, each with its own temper. They are sliced thin to make them last boiled, until tender, sometimes roasted in the hearth's embers, for a sweetness that tastes like memory. Garlic finds its way into everything, both for flavour and for faith. It is medicine as much as spice, warding off both illness and evil. Peasants trust it more than the priest's blessings, and perhaps rightly so. When fortune smiles, there is meat, a salted piece of pork hung since autumn, or a smoked fish from the river. Meat is rarely eaten alone. It is an accent, a reminder of feast days stirred into porridge or crumbled into broth. The rich scent travels through the village like rumour, and neighbours smile at one another, knowingly not in envy, but in shared longing. For in winter, even the smell of meat is a kind of nourishment. On fasting days, which come often, eggs replace flesh. They are precious, gathered carefully before they freeze in the nest, wrapped in wool or kept near the hearth. A single egg can feed a child or enrich a loaf. Cheese too finds its place firm sharp, a relic of green pastures, now sleeping under snow. It keeps for months if salted well, its surface rubbed with ash, to discourage mould. To cut into such cheese in February is to taste sunlight that fell 6 months ago. There are drinks, simple but strong. Small beer brewed weak enough to be safer than water foams lightly in wooden mugs. Ale is thicker, more serious, shared sparingly, especially by women who nurse or men who mend. Cider is a gift of regions where apples thrive. Its sweetness holds the ghost of autumn's gold. On feast days, honeyed mead glows like liquid fire in the cup. It burns the throat and lights the mind for stories. Each meal begins with quiet. There are no formal prayers, only murmurs of gratitude, half habit, half hope. A father may trace a small cross on the bread before cutting. A mother might whisper the names of those lost last winter. The youngest child watches learning reverence, not from words, but from the careful pace of each motion. The way bread is passed clockwise, the way bowls are filled for elders first, the way no one eats before all are served. These gestures keep the room from forgetting itself. The firelight turns the walls amber and shadows bend across the rafters like patient saints. The family eats with wooden spoons, each holding its own measure of the day's warmth. Conversation moves slowly, broken by the sound of chewing, by the crackle of wood, by the occasional sigh. When the bowl's empty, there is always a moment of stillness, not of hunger, but of reflection, a silence filled by the presence of enough. Sometimes, neighbours share what they can, a jug of ale carried through the snow, a loaf baked too large a handful of dried herbs from a garden, still fragrant under frost. These exchanges are not charity, but covenant. In the village, generosity is insurance. What you give in one winter will find its way back in another. To refuse a gift is considered unlucky, as if closing a door against the warmth of one's own survival. Children play their small games with food. They carve faces into turnips before roasting them, pretend the bubbles in broth are tiny spirits escaping. Their laughter, brief and bright, reminds the adults of other winters when they themselves believed in such things. In the deep dark of the year, that laughter is its own kind of feast. On feast days, proper Christmas Epiphany Candlemas, the table transforms. The best linens appear smelling faintly of lavender from the summer chest. Candles are lit, not for necessity, but for joy. The bread is baked round, symbol of eternity. The broth is thickened with barley, or rice, if any can be found. A pie may appear filled with dried fruit, its sweetness so rare that the youngest trembles at the first taste. Music hums low from a flute or fiddle, clumsy but sincere. For a few hours, winter seems to loosen its grip and the world remembers abundance. But even in ordinary days, the peasants find their own small rituals of comfort. A crust dipped in hot broth for an elder whose teeth are failing. A cup of milk warmed for a child who cannot sleep. A bone set aside for the dog who guards the door. These gestures matter as much as any feast. They are proof that kindness survives scarcity, that warmth can live in the hands even when the house is cold. As the meal ends, the scraps are gathered carefully. Nothing is wasted. The last spoonful of broth is poured onto stale bread for tomorrow's breakfast. Bones are set to boil again until they surrender every flavour to the next day's pot. The table is wiped with a damp cloth and the crumbs brushed to the hearth, where they vanish into flame. Then, as always, the family sits for a moment longer, staring into the fire. They do not speak of spring, not yet. But each knows that if they keep this rhythm, if they respect the boundaries of the cellar, the patience of the pot, the grace of the table, they will see green fields again. Outside the snow deepens. Inside the air is thick with smoke bread and the faint sweetness of onion. The youngest child curls against a parent's side. Someone hums a melody without words. It is a tune older than the church bells, older than hunger, the music of survival itself. And so the winter table holds not just food, but faith in the ground that still remembers how to give in the hands that learned, how to save in the quiet knowledge that warmth once shared multiplies. Here in the flicker of firelight and the smell of rye life continues humble, persistent, and full of grace. The monastic wisdom, herbs and healing in the cold. When the village grows small under winter, and the lanes grow dumb with snow, a different kind of life continues just beyond its edge, behind stone walls, where bells divide the day and hands learn the grammar of gentleness. The monastery keeps time the way a hearth keeps flame. Matin's Lord's prime prayers stitch the hours together, while in the quiet between them another work endures, the slow tending of plants and bodies, the keeping of remedies that spell warmth into the cold months. Even in winter, the physic garden does not fall entirely mute. Along the south walk of the cloister, where stone drinks what light the day affords, beds of thyme, sage, and winter savoury hold their scent like pocketed embers. Rosmarinus stands upright against the wall, its needles resinous, fit for breath and memory. In the corners where wind forgets to pass, parsley still shows green. A clump of chives leans toward the noon sun, like a vow to return. The monks and nuns know these places by heart. They have learned the topography of mercy. A sill that never freezes, a flagstone that stays warm till dusk, a glazed shard, set like a small window over a frame of wattle to lend a thin greenhouse to a tender shoot. They do not call it invention, they call it care. Within the still room keeps summer's languages alive. Racks hang with bundles of mint hyssop yarrow. Wicker trays hold marigold petals like bottled sunlight. Jars of elderberries rest dark as midnight beside rose hips the colour of embers. Everything is labelled with a neat hand. Latin, where it is known, a vernacular name, where it is not, and sometimes a brief note. Good for a chest that will not loosen, to sweeten sleep for a wound that remembers the iron. A mortar waits on the table, its bowl stained with the green of 100 crushings. A pestle lies beside it, like a trusted tool whose work is always the same and never finished. The craft is not sorcery, it is patience arranged into method. Leaves are bruised to teach them how to give. Roots are sliced thin and left to dry on rush mats until they snap like twigs. Bark is shaved in narrow curls, stored away from damp. Infusions are the gentlest ask, boiling water, poured over a small fist of herb, a steep undercloth steam, rising with a smell that could bring tears for reasons both chemical and remembered. Decoctions are sterner roots, and bark simmered low until the water learns their bitterness and turns it into strength. Vinegars are sharp tutors, pulling virtue from plant into acid to be kept for winter salads when the body longs for something bright. Honey bears many burdens. It is a balm, a binder, a sweet peace offered to the throat. When stirred with thyme and a slow splash of vinegar, it becomes oxymel, good for coughs and stubborn chests or so, the pages say. Those pages are guarded as carefully as any relic. In the scriptorium, where lamps smoulder like small moons and windows sweat with cold, a brother copies a paragraph on the uses of plantain, while another corrects a line on comfrey with a pricked point and a sigh. A sister in a nearby house might do the same. Her marginalia practical, best gathered when the dew is off. Boil no longer than it takes to recite the psalm. If a text is unclear, they consult the garden. If the garden is unclear, they consult time. The book of living things edits the book of ink, and both are bound by humility. The infirmary hums softly in winter, softer than in harvest. For injuries now are fewer, but aches are more faithful. Beds and narrow blankets heavy. A pot on the corner brazier murmurs with willow bark. Cups of linden flowers steam at matins for the old who carry the season in their joints. A novice warms a brick by the hearth and wraps it in linen before slipping it at a patient's feet. Another rubs a salve of goose fat and marigold into a chilblained hand that has drawn too much water from a well. Doors are kept from slamming, not from etiquette alone, but because pain resents surprise. On a high shelf sit little cones of incense, juniper and rosemary, sometimes bay-burned, in a dish to clear the air when coughing passes from bed to bed like a rumour. Whether the smoke heals or merely heartens, no one bothers to decide. Winter requires both. Travellers arrive with their own ailments and their own stories. Frostbitten shepherds, a midwife from the valley with a raw throat and a pouch of gossip, a carter whose breath rattles like a cart on frozen ruts. They are met with broth first and questions after. What brings you? How long has the cough troubled you? Where does it hurt when you laugh? The questions are practical, the listening exact. A finger presses beneath a rib, an ear leans to a chest. A tongue is asked to say, "Ah," not to prove obedience, but to show a colour that will teach what the book cannot. Diagnosis is not certainty. It is attention sharpened by prayer. Faith does not stand apart from this labour. It stands within it. A brother blesses the water, not because the water will forget its work without a blessing, but because the hands that pour it are steadier when hope is spoken aloud. A sister bends over a poultice and hums the antiphon that her mother hummed, though her mother never wore a veil. Such songs are not spells. They are metronomes for carekeeping time, while linen is wrung, while a spoon cools before it meets a patient's lip, while a back is rubbed until breath settles and sleep remembers its duty. Occasionally, the monastery receives a plant new to their tongue. A pilgrim opens a pouch and spills out seeds pale as bone. A travelling clerk describes a root that smelled of camphor in a southern market. The community receives such gifts with courtesy and suspicion. They will try the plant in the sheltered bed by the south wall, visit it in frost, taste a leaf on a brave day. Watch how bees ignore or embrace it. The herb will earn its space or lose it, not by reputation, but by proof. Winter is too honest for myths that do not work. The line between medicine and kitchen grows tender in these months. Sage from the infirmary becomes sage in the pot. Garlic rubbed with salt on a board becomes both condiment and charm. Vinegar that drew the colour from violets in May becomes the sour that wakes a February appetite. The refectory serves pottage after vespers, and on each table stands a clay dish of mustard seed, ground with wine, a little heat, to put in the mouth what is missing from the sky. To eat is to heal is to eat wisely. The rule does not write it so, the body does. Not every patient mends. The monastery knows how to keep watch. They bank the fire, so the room will not startle with cold just as sleep begins to claim a fever. They change linens as if changing the page of a fragile book. They sit not counting minutes but beads, and lend their breaths to a chest that labours. If the dying has come, they bring oil and words, and the pressure of a hand that says, "You are not alone." The herbs withdraw then, the prayers continue. Winter does not win or lose. In these rooms it teaches scale. And still beneath the dark work accrues towards spring. In the chapter house, a list is made for sowing angelica, if last year's root was true. More fennel for the kitchen. Foxglove noted only as a warning for beauty is not the same as kindness. In the garden, a novice breaks thin ice on a water butt at noon, so the sun will tame the shock before roots are offered a drink. Jars are topped up with fresh beeswax. Labels are rewritten where ink has paled. The last of the elderberry syrup is measured out with a frugal hand. The house thinks ahead by small obediences. Sometimes on a windless afternoon, the bell rings, none, and the cloister briefly fills with light, as if the stone itself had remembered July. A sister stops, closes her eyes, and inhales the rosemary by the wall. A brother pauses with a basket of wood, and just for a breath believes the air tastes of grass. Then the light moves, and work resumes, steady, exact, unafraid. This is the monastery's winter, not a fortress against the season, but a conversation with it. Herbs answer cold with fragrance, vinegar answers dullness, with edge honey, answers ache with sweetness, and people answer one another with presence. Outside the snow edits the world down to essentials. Inside the shelves and jars, quietly insist that even in the narrow months there is room for tenderness. When spring at last puts a green sentence back in the fields, it will find the monastery ready, not because they conquered winter, but because they kept faith with the small patient heats that never left. The return of the Sunday. The change does not come suddenly. It comes like a whisper first. A new softness in the air, a hint of brightness that lingers half a minute longer on the thatch before fading. No one in the village dares call it spring yet. That word would feel like boasting. But the signs begin to gather quietly. The snow, once so sure of itself, now shrinks back from the edges of roofs and fences, pulling away as if embarrassed by its own authority. Water trickles again, finding old paths through the ruts of the lane. When a child bends close to listen, he can hear the earth clearing its throat. The peasants feel the change before they see it. Their boots no longer creak with frost. Their breath no longer turns instantly to smoke. The air smells of damp wood and thawing hay. It is not warmth, yet more like the memory of warmth returning, cautiously testing the ground. On mornings when the light touches the eastern hills, the world looks bruised, as if waking from a long sleep. It is a colour without name, between grey and gold, and it makes the heart ache for reasons no one can quite explain. Work begins again not with celebration, but with familiarity. The long waiting of winter has trained the body for stillness. Now it must relearn motion. Men step into the fields with spades and forks their shoulders still stiff from months by the fire. They walk the furrows, slowly testing the soil with the edge of a boot. The ground resists at first, heavy and reluctant, but beneath the top crust it has begun to loosen. When the first handful of earth crumbles between their fingers, there is a joy that cannot be spoken aloud. Only a nod exchanged a sound in the throat that might be laughter or a sigh. The ditches carved before winter are tested now. Water runs through them with a murmur-like speech. If they overflow the men, patch them with straw. If they dry too quickly, they open a new cut. It is work that looks simple, but holds the year's fate. A ditch an inch too shallow can drown a crop. An inch too deep can starve it. They know this by memory, not by measure. Their fathers and their fathers' fathers walked the same lines with the same calculations made by eye and instinct. Survival, after all, is just another word for precision practiced over centuries. The women take their labour back to the yards and gardens. They lift away the straw that shielded the cabbages, shake the mould from onion ropes, and inspect each bed with a care that feels almost maternal. In the corners where sunlight lingers, green shoots have already begun to write the first sentences of the new season. A sprig of thyme, a thread of parsley, the faint sheen of chive. It is modest, but it is proof. The women smile without meaning to. These small resurrections never lose their wonder. Children are sent out with baskets to gather sticks, and brush for new fires. Their boots sink into the thawing ground, releasing smells buried since autumn mud rot and the faint sweetness of things becoming soil. They chase one another across the yard, slipping in the wet, laughing when they fall. The sound of their laughter feels strange, almost fragile, after months of quiet. It reminds the adults that the world has not forgotten joy, only postponed it. In the monastery garden, brothers and sisters step out to breathe the same air. They prune the dead from the living trim, the lavender, and loosen the soil around the rosemary that has survived another winter. The first bees appear sluggish, but determined, hovering over the cloister walls. A brother points upward with a smile. God's small messengers have returned. The phrase has been spoken each year for centuries, and still it feels new. The animals sense it too. Cows low softly in the byre, restless for pasture. Chickens scratch near the doorway, pecking at thawed ground. Sheep are sheared, not yet, but soon. Their wool, heavy and dirty from the months indoors, carries the smell of smoke and straw. Dogs grow leaner, with movement prowling the fences, sniffing the wind as if it carries messages. Everything alive begins to stretch. As the days lengthen, the village finds its rhythm again. The bell at the church rings with a clearer sound, no longer muffled by snow. The mornings fill with motion buckets, voices smoke. The silence that winter brought was not broken, only transformed. Now it becomes a kind of harmony. The scrape of a spade, the creak of leather, the bark of a dog, the sudden song of a blackbird, daring to test its own throat. The peasants pause at such sounds and smile faintly. They have lived long enough to know that the first song of spring is not sung by people, but by things returning to themselves. Yet the thaw brings its own dangers. Roads collapse into mud. The river runs too high. Roofs leak where ice split the seams. Work never truly ends. It only changes shape. Some complain softly that the cold was easier. At least it was honest. But most prefer this new uncertainty because it carries possibility. The worst is over, and that knowledge moves through the village like a hidden current, making hands quicker, eyes brighter. Evenings still fall early, but the light has changed. It is no longer the pale light of endurance, but the tender light of renewal. In its glow, cottages look less weary. Smoke rises straighter. People linger outside a little longer before closing the door. There is a new warmth in their talk, even when it concerns the same old worries: seeds, tools, debts, weather. The words sound lighter, as though each sentence carries a little sun within it. And when the first true dawn of spring arrives, the one no one dares predict, it does not announce itself with trumpets. It comes quietly through the open shutter of a cottage window, across a floor swept clean the night before. The light touches a bowl, a pair of boots, a sleeping child. It smells faintly of wet grass. Outside, mist lifts from the fields, and the land reveals itself again, whole and waiting. The peasants step out and squint toward the horizon, where the sun, golden and patient, rises, like a promise kept. They stand still for a moment, hands on hips, faces warmed by a light they had almost forgotten. No one speaks. They do not need to. Every field, every wall, every frost-bitten hedge says it for them. The year has turned, the world has remembered them once more. In that fragile morning, surrounded by meltwater and mud, they feel rich beyond measure. For all the hunger and the hardship, they have arrived again at the beginning. And this, they know, is what survival truly means. Not victory over winter, but faith in the thaw. Lessons of the frost. When the last frost finally withdraws, leaving behind its silver signature on the grass, the village exhales. The season that tested every hand, every root, every heartbeat has at last loosened its grip. Smoke rises thinly from the chimneys, less from need now than from habit. The air smells of damp earth and distant growth. It is a small thing, almost invisible, but to those who have endured the long sleep of winter, it feels like grace. The peasants have no word for resilience. They simply live it. What they learn each winter cannot be written on parchment or carved into stone. It is carried instead in their gestures, in the way they cut a loaf patch, a roof, share the last ladle of broth without complaint. They do not speak of endurance as a virtue. To them it is as natural as breathing and just as necessary. If there is pride, it hides itself in silence. To survive is enough. Winter teaches in a language without mercy. It strips away the unnecessary until only truth remains. You learn that warmth is not comfort, but cooperation, that one person's fire is weaker than a neighbour's shared ember. You learn that food is not measured by fullness, but by fairness, that a loaf divided among many feeds the soul more than the body. You learn too that faith does not belong solely to churches or prayers. It lives in small, ordinary acts, covering the herbs before a freeze, whispering to the oxen as they pull, believing the seed will remember how to wake. For the medieval peasant, the frost is not an enemy, but a tutor. It teaches patience first. You cannot rush thaw any more than you can rush forgiveness. The land moves at its own rhythm, and the wise learn to walk beside it instead of ahead. It teaches humility next. No matter how careful the harvest, how well stored the roots a winter too long, can unmake all plans. The earth does not answer to desire. It answers only to time. And in that humility, a quiet dignity blooms, the kind that comes from knowing one's place in the order of things and accepting it without shame. Perhaps the greatest lesson is gratitude, not the loud kind sung in cathedrals, but the soft kind whispered over a bowl of soup or breathed into the steam of morning. Gratitude for the cow that still gives milk, after the cold for the neighbour who lent a handful of grain for the hearth that never quite went out. In a world where nothing is guaranteed, every small mercy feels miraculous. Even the wind, when it warms a little, feels like a blessing spoken directly to the skin. Winter also reminds them that death is not the opposite of life, but its companion. Some do not see the spring. Their names are spoken over the thawed earth, and their tools are cleaned and passed on. Yet the peasants do not see this as cruelty. They see it as part of the same circle that governs seed and harvest, darkness and dawn. In a world that never stops returning to itself, endings are only beginnings, wearing a different face. From the frost, they also learn silence. During those long nights, when the world held its breath, they discovered that silence is not emptiness, but space. Space for thought, for prayer, for remembering. In that stillness, they heard the soft conversations of wood and whined the creak of snow beneath a step. The heartbeat of the earth, slowing but never stopping. They learned that the quiet holds truth better than noise ever could. Now, as sunlight stretches across the fields and the first plough cuts into loosened soil, those lessons linger. The frost may be gone, but its teachings remain beneath their calloused hands. The men bend to the plough, not as conquerors, but as partners. The women plant their herbs again, with the same tenderness they once used to tuck them under straw. The children who have seen hunger's sharp face and laughter's thin endurance now run with a fiercer joy, as if each moment is something to be tasted twice. In time, winter will return. It always does. The villagers know this as surely as they know their own names. Yet they do not fear it. Each cycle makes them wiser, steadier, more attuned to the quiet logic of the world. They understand now that the frost is not punishment nor trial, but balance. It takes so that it may give back. It humbles so that it may remind. It sleeps so that life may learn to wake again. If you were to walk through the village on a morning of early spring, you would see it in their faces, that calm familiarity with hardship, that peace born, not of ease, but of understanding. They know the worth of fire because they have felt the cold. They know the value of bread because they have tasted hunger. And above all, they know that survival is not an accident. It is a choice made daily with patience, with kindness, and with the quiet courage of those who expect nothing and yet prepare for everything. The frost has left its lessons written everywhere, in the careful mending of a roof, in the rhythm of a hoe against thawed soil, in the hush that falls over the fields at dusk. It has written them too, in the people themselves, in their hands, their habits, their hearts. And when the next snow comes, as it surely will, they will greet it not with fear, but with a kind of recognition, the way one greets an old teacher returning after a long journey. For in the end, that is what winter truly is, not an enemy to be endured, but a teacher to be remembered. It speaks in silence, instructs through scarcity, and leaves behind a single enduring truth, that life, even at its coldest, carries warmth within it, waiting to be found. Morning comes softly, almost shy, as if uncertain it has permission to return. A thin mist curls above the fields, lifting like a slow exhale after a long-held breath. The frost has retreated to the shadows. The earth damp and dark gleams in the new light. From the cottages' doors open one by one. Men step out with tools on their shoulders. Women carry baskets of seed, and children trail behind them, still blinking sleep from their eyes. For the first time in many months, no one looks up to check the sky in fear. The sun, pale but steady, has kept its promise. The fields smell alive again, a mingling of soil, ash, and the faint sweetness of thaw. Each footprint sinks just deep enough to make the sound of soft giving. Water gathers in narrow veins along the furrows, glinting where it catches the light. The land, bruised by winter's long grip, now seems to pulse faintly underfoot, as if it were breathing. It has endured, and so have those who work it. There is tenderness in that shared endurance, a quiet kinship between the peasants and the soil they serve. In the cottages, fires burn low, no longer in desperation, but in gratitude. Bread rises again, smelling faintly of rye and patience. A pot simmers for the first time with fresh herbs, a gift from the new season. The walls, once shrunken with cold, seem to widen. Even silence feels warmer now. The villagers speak little of what they have survived. They do not need to. The proof lies in the smoke, in the footprints, in the laughter that returns to the lanes like a shy visitor rediscovering the way home. By midday, the bell from the church tower rings out across the fields, its tone brighter than it has been for months. It does not summon them to prayer, not formally, but the sound itself is a kind of prayer. It tells the living that they have been remembered, that time has turned its wheel once more. The peasants pause their work and look toward the sound, not to worship, but to listen. In that listening, something sacred unfolds, the knowledge that the hardest season has passed and the simplest acts still have meaning. As the sun climbs, the ground warms enough to release its scent, the deep musk of life renewed. You can almost hear it, a faint stirring beneath the surface, a tremor of green about to speak. Seeds that slept for months stretch their invisible arms toward the light. Somewhere a lark begins its song, and the note rises pure into the sky. The world is waking. And so the peasants bend once more to their work, not as victims of the cold, but as students of its lessons. They have learned that nothing, not even frost, lasts forever, that patience, kindness, and quiet faith can carry warmth through any darkness. The earth breathes again, and with it they breathe too. If this quiet journey through medieval life has warmed your thoughts tonight, stay with Sleepless Historian. Let these stories of endurance and quiet courage accompany you into rest, a reminder that even in the coldest seasons of history life always finds a way to bloom again.